This is a true and relatively unremarkable story that I nevertheless hope is worth sharing with you this Easter morning. Yesterday was a lovely, ordinary, early spring day in Philadelphia. I was on my way to Trader Joe's just after 8 in the morning to buy some racks of lamb that I had noticed they had earlier in the week. Felix was with me, and we were walking west on Market Street beneath the crisp blue sky, when I happened to glance across the street and noticed a person lying in the street, more or less in front of her neighbors, other human beings, stretched out on the sidewalk in some state of want, more often than you should. It happens often enough that the sight of a prone body on the ground is not actually an immediate signal that help should be summoned. To make such a statement from the pulpit sounds amazing and sad, but I offer it as both a confession and an assertion of the state of affairs in our city, in our world. There's a spot by the steps to the coffee shop down the street that's warmed by a vent, and so is often occupied at night and in the mornings by a person lying down before its warmth. There are manhole covers at the corner of 18th and Walnut Street and 19th Street too that provide warm spots where persons may often be found inside those doors in our garden, where there are a few reasonably safe and sheltered spots to lie down for the night. So to see a person lying on the ground here in the city does not, I'm sorry to say, raise an instant alarm. But the person I saw yesterday wasn't on the sidewalk, they were in the street. I did not see how the person came to be lying there. I noticed no commotion. I did not hear the person cry out. I did not detect any movement from the person. I noticed from across the street that the person was missing one shoe, and I had already noted that the morning was more than chilly, it was cold. This was a situation where my help was needed and possibly wanted. Two details caused me to cross the street and check. First, the missing shoe, which I noticed was actually just a couple of yards away from the person on the sidewalk. Second, the fact that this person was not lying down on the sidewalk, but in the street where a bus might pull up. Cars were, in fact, not many, it was 8 o'clock in the morning, but cars were, in fact, driving past. Perhaps, I thought, a good Samaritan was indeed required. I remember that story. Let me assure you that the story gets no more dramatic than this. A woman had tripped and fallen into the street, losing her left shoe in the process. Older, and she was afraid that she'd broken it, and she couldn't get up. Up close, I could see that the woman was in pain, and either frightened or unable to move, probably both, and cold. I knelt beside her to reassure her as I dialed 911. I asked her name, Rashida, and I told her mine. And I repeated that everything would be all right. Everything will be all right. The ambulance will be here. The fire department is just a block away. And the ambulance came. I watched them pull out of the driveway in less than 2 minutes. And they put Rashida's shoe on her foot, and they helped her up, and I collected her keys and her phone, which she'd dropped, and handed them to the EMT, and off they went to the hospital. Absolutely the only noteworthy aspect of this story for me was the calculus that I had to do to decide to cross the street. You understand that the calculus was not, I think, whether or not I wanted to help someone in distress. I'd like to think that I'd have leapt over traffic had I seen Rashida fall or heard her scream. The question wasn't even whether or not the person lying there in the street needed help. Of course she needed help. The person on the manhole cover needs help. The person in the garden needs help. But such is the state of our soul. Also, often it is not readily accepted. For me, yesterday morning, the calculation was this: does that person over there lying in the street want help? And if so, is there anything I can do to provide it? A few minutes after the ambulance carried Rashida off, I was inside Trader Joe's, discovering that they did not, in fact, have any racks of lamb, as I'd been promised the day before they would. Not even first thing in the morning. We'll have them tomorrow, they told me. That's what you said yesterday, I said. And as Felix and I walked home, lambless, I couldn't have cared less that I was still without a crucial ingredient for Easter dinner. I was just glad. And I knew that there was a decent chance that I might not have done so, because I might have thought that it was just one more shoeless person lying face down in the street. Again, it sounds a little sick to hear it from the pulpit, doesn't it? Now, I don't want to make too much of this episode, and I certainly don't want to portray myself as an unsung hero because I bothered to cross the street to help someone who tripped and fallen. Remember, the point of this story differently and failed to cross the street. Here's another simple story I want to tell you. This one isn't my story. It's the story of an old and dear friend. I've told it a few times already in the past week, of mine, who happened to be at a meeting at Trinity Church on Wall Street, just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, on the morning of September 11th, 2001. The details are worth knowing sometime of my friend's escape, if I can call it that, from Ground Zero. MTs and the workmen and the family members and the co-workers and the coroners and the grief-stricken and the horrified and the mourning and all the bereft and anyone at all who had reason to be there at that ash-covered apocalyptic site. But I won't rehearse that story with you now. I want to share with you an observation that someone else shared with my friend as the first spring after 9/11 approached, and therefore the first Easter after 9/11 approached. There at Ground Zero that spring, they looked up, and they saw in the trees, because there are trees around Trinity Church, you know, they saw towers, and from the offices and businesses that once inhabited those buildings, debris strewn in the branches of the trees. After all those months, paper, fabric, metal, I don't know. And how it weighed their hearts as they tried to bring some love and some mercy into those devastated streets and into the lives of those who had to be there. How it pained them to see the wreckage of that act of murderous cruelty still hanging there in the branches of the trees, even as the trees were budding with spring's new green. How it made them wonder if we would all ever recover from this collective injury, if there was ever going to be a way out of the pain, and still caught up in the branches and the buds of the trees. But then someone noticed the chirping of birds. And when the birds were observed more closely, they noticed that the birds were seen to be busy building nests. And to make their nests, the birds, as it happens, were collecting bits of that dreadful debris that hung in the trees, and using the debris of 9/11 in order to build nests for themselves where, as the psalmist says, they may lay their young. That the birds might take the wreckage of death and destruction and use it to build nests for their young seemed to perfectly encapsulate the Easter gospel that God's gift of life triumphs over death. If death, resurrection began to seem possible. We have a tendency to see the resurrection as something that happened, in the one hand, a long, long time ago in history, or on the other hand, as some hope that lies beyond a set of pearly gates. But the tendency to see the resurrection in either the distant past or the distant future means that we have a lot of trouble with resurrection in the here and now. And if we are going to see the power of the resurrection in the here and now, we need to see it at work, not only for the birds, but in our own lives too. The birds don't need news that resurrection happens all the time, that between the memory of Jesus' resurrection in the past and the hope of some general resurrection someday in the future, there is resurrection unfolding around us all the time, where that which had been cast down is being raised up, where that which had grown old is being made new, in which that which had been left for dead is given new life. Now look, Rashida hadn't been left for dead. I know that. I'm back on Market Street now, on the way to Trader Joe's. But you know that not every body that's lying in the street gets up and makes it to safety. And especially not every black body. Some version of the calculation I described in determining whether or not to cross the street yesterday morning takes place all the time, including in situations that are a lot more fraught than the situation I encountered yesterday morning. And the mere juxtaposition at the moment of a white man on his knee in the street beside a black person in trouble is, at this moment in time, complicated, fraught, and by no means a sign that points to something good. So the resurrection moment wasn't to be found in anything I did to bring her and took her to the hospital. The resurrection moment was when God moved me somewhere in my heart or in my head or in some negotiation between the two, when God moved me to walk across the street, to overcome the several forces that might easily have kept me on my side of the street. The resurrection moment came when it was clear to me that I could not pass by on the other side, so that some small fragment of good could come between me and this person on the street, between two people who might easily have always, or maybe the resurrection moment came when I left Trader Joe's empty-handed, but realized that my errand had been fruitful anyway. Just to be perfectly clear, the way I see it, I was the recipient of the resurrection moment, of the gift of resurrection in this moment, since God was teaching me how to live beyond my selfishness. Someone was going to help Rashida yesterday morning. I assume the only question for me was, would it be me? And I'm telling you that the answer could very easily have been no. My friend from New York recently urged me to consider whether there might be, what there might be, transforming, life-giving. She was asking what debris there might be, so to speak, caught in the branches from the trees from which the birds, and maybe even you and me, might build nests. My God, it's been an awful year. But maybe, just maybe, from all the terribleness of this year, some of us are learning to look for resurrection. Some of us are learning to expect resurrection. Some of us are the way we respond to our neighbors, being ever more ready to do so with mercy, care, and love, which is precisely what Jesus taught us to do before he showed us with his own body, with his own life, exactly what resurrection looks like. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.